Re-
Hello, my name is Kim Poe. I'm the Children and Young Adult Consultant with the Connecticut State Library, and this is a presentation on creating inclusive library collections. So we're going to start with what are inclusive collections, and the term inclusive was very intentional. So inclusivity is like actively and consciously and cultivating an environment where differences are affirmed and embraced, which makes it a little bit different from diversity, but let's just kind of like dive into that a little bit more. So in building diverse library collections, we work to make sure that we have multiple voices in our collection. We have voices with Latinx characters, disabled characters, South Asian characters, Muslim characters, and so on and so forth. We also make sure that the authors who are telling these stories have a similar background to the main character, right? Which is where the term own voices came from. The way that I explain the difference between a diverse collection and an inclusive one is whose voice is represented where and how many versions of representation are there. So in libraries, we can easily find books that feature cis white characters going on adventures and fighting dragons. We can find these folks in historical fiction, westerns, cozy mysteries, like clean romance, and so on and so forth. And we need to see that across the racial, cultural, and accessible diaspora. So, merely having books on your shelves that feature minority or invisible characters isn't enough if they're pigeonholed into specific storylines within that collection. So, we need to make sure that marginalized voices are present in all genres and spaces within our library collection. It's not enough to have books with LGBTQ protagonists coming out to friends and family. That's kind of step one of this process. Step two is we want to make sure that we can see LGBTQ plus protagonists adventuring and using magic like Percy Jackson, right? We want to see intersectionality. So not only is a character a member of the LGBTQ plus community, but maybe they're also disabled. Maybe they're a person of color, right? Like we need more variety here. So inclusivity isn't merely having multiple voices on our shelves, it's showcasing multiple voices, embarking on all types of literary journey. So what does that look like? A lot of things come up when talking about inclusive collections, but there's one that I hear more than anything else, and that's, that um, people in my community aren't taking quote unquote these books. And since budgets are tight, shouldn't they be spent on books that we, quote unquote, know people are going to take? So let's break this down a little bit. So if we, be it we're hand selling this to a patron during a reference interview, or whether we've gathered some stats on what types of subjects of books our folks are taking. Let's just go with this example, right? So we have a patron in front of us, or we know that or so we have a patron in front of us who likes Sophie Kinsella and like Janet Ivanovich, right? Um, so that tells us a little bit about what this type of person likes to read. They like, things that have a little bit of romance. They might like quirky characters. They might like just a little bit of adventure in there. So, what types of books might we give this patron, or what types of books might we display if we know that we've got high circulation in books like this? So, here we have exactly what this fictional patron asked for, right? These are 5 books about modern women that are full of like laughs and romance and some adventure and blunders. And what you'll notice is that these books center main characters of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. So we've given the patron what they have asked for, and we have been inclusive about it. Just as easily as we suggest Percy Jackson to a child of color, we can suggest the banned bookshop of Maggie Banks to a white reader. It is very rare that someone is coming into our library and they are telling us that they only want to read books by about a certain race or about a certain ethnic background. And quite frankly, when someone comes in and asks for that, they are typically from a marginalized background, and it is hard for them to find books where they can see themselves represented. But it's not often that you find someone who comes in and says, I'm able-bodied, I only want to read books about able-bodied characters. Don't give me any books with characters with disabilities. Like, it just doesn't, it's not often that that happens. And if it does happen, go forth. But that's typically not what's happening. Someone is coming in and they're asking for a genre, they're asking for a read-alike, and we are giving them what, right? So let's take a look at like another example. So we might have someone who comes in and they say that they really love YA mysteries. It is right now, anyway, it is October. It is spooky season. So this is not off the table for what people might be asking for. So here, like this grouping of 5 books has main characters who are white, who are Hispanic, who are Black, and who are deaf. This selection of books also has books with LGBTQIA plus representation and books that don't feature any romance. This selection of books where their selection of books here where the mysteries tie deeply into racism and inequity and social justice, and there are books where it doesn't. So just 5 books here covers a lot of territory, and this is what someone's going to come in and ask for. They're going to come in and they're going to ask for YA mysteries, please. They're going to ask for mysteries and say that they're like 16. This is what they're asking for, but what are we giving them? What are we displaying for them? Like what knowledge do we have about books so that we can better help our patrons select what it is that they're looking for when they come in with a subject or looking for read-alikes? And sort of the last one for fiction anyway, right, is historical fiction. Now, I don't read a ton of historical fiction, which is why I was you'll see adult titles and middle grade titles here, but it's the same basic concept. So you might know that a lot of folks in your community are checking out historical fiction books. Great, love to see it. So here we've got a book, Lone Women, that is an adult historical fiction that takes place during like the 1800s or something. And not only is there homesteading, but there's also like a really fascinating mystery aspect. We've got a book written by Linda Sue Park, who is an Asian author and has written a book about an Asian girl and her white father moving out west to live life. And what's interesting is that in the notes section, Linda Sue Park herself wrote that this story probably wouldn't have happened this way. So, which is why it's historical fiction and why she kind of had to make it up, because otherwise she probably wouldn't have been able to see herself in a story like this. Women of the Post, Black women, historical fiction, male. Post office, USPS, right? We've got a historical fiction book that features a deaf character. So again, like when someone's coming in and they're asking for a genre, which we know we get a lot of people who will tell us the genres that they like. What do we have available for them? What are we suggesting to them? And in our book knowledge, what have we educated ourselves about, right? But this is the type of well-rounded collection that we need to have so that we can provide these services to our patrons, right? This is it. This is what we mean. This is what it looks like when we say an inclusive collection. This is what we're talking about. We're not talking about pigeonholing groups of people into certain spaces. We're spreading it out. So nonfiction, right? What do we do about nonfiction? If someone comes in and they want a book about like cowboys or something like that, what do we give them? And the reality is the process is the same. Um, the realities of nonfiction means that sometimes facts and literary merit of a work are going to take precedent in a topic. But when that's not the case, it's important to remain cognizant of whose voices are included in your library's collection, right? So if someone comes in and they're doing research on rocks and minerals, right? Like, I don't know, the Earth's crust or something like that. Does it matter what books we give them? Maybe it does. I do not know, but maybe it doesn't, right? Maybe we go to that section of Dewey or Library of Congress subject headings and we give this person what they need, and then we go on about our day. But if someone comes in and they are looking for books about the Holocaust or Japanese internment camps, does it matter whose voice is represented in the collection of books that we find for them? I would say unequivocally yes. So nonfiction, depending on the subject matter, might be a little different, but it might not. I once gave the example of does it matter who explains why Pluto isn't a planet anymore? And I said it probably doesn't, as long as the information that you're getting is correct. And I want to say it was at another one of these PDs that someone actually told me it does matter. They were from an academic library and they said that there aren't a lot of women in space science, right, or in the sciences in general. So to have a book written by a female scientist would actually be really important to try to have. So, right, like some of these decisions people are going to have to make for themselves, right? So moving on. Why do we need to build inclusive collections? Now that we've established that we need to do this and what the end goal could look like, why? Again, I can imagine a lot of people work in communities that are majority white, or perhaps are in communities that are incredibly conservative, and you're concerned about how your communities might respond. So what do we do? So what we do is we look to the future, right? It's important to remember that what your community looks like today is not what your community might look like tomorrow. For the first time, non-Hispanic white residents now make up less than half, 49.9% of the nation's under age 15 population, according to the 2018 U.S. Census Bureau estimates. And it frightens me to think about how long ago 2018 was, but it was quite some time ago. So it would interest me to know how much that percentage number has shifted. And the fact that white children under 15 have already become a minority in their age group puts an exclamation on the fact that the nation's diversity is percolating from the bottom up as the white population ages. I think it's really important that libraries really, really either don't or stop, if this is something that's currently happening, stop being reactive. We're seeing a lot of this, and we'll get to this, we'll touch on it just a little bit. We're seeing a lot of very reactive actions in libraries with regards to things like book challenges. We see this in public libraries quite a bit. Where, folks show up to a town hall meeting, one thing or another, and someone is really challenging a book, right? Or a group of people are really challenging a book in their public library. One thing that public libraries really have in their pocket to lean into and to help support them as they are working to keep these books on their shelves and make them accessible to anyone who walks through the door who may find a need for them, is a collection management policy. And what we are seeing is that updating the collection management policy has been pushed back and pushed back and pushed back because other things were quote unquote more important. So as these book challenges are showing up, libraries don't have a leg to stand on. Their policy is 10, 15, 20 years old, and they don't have it to help. So I think it's really important that we stop, like, we don't wait for the thing to happen. We don't wait for our community to have more people of color in there, more marginalized people, more whatever. We don't wait for that to happen. And then we decide to pay attention to our collection, because at that point, marginalized and oppressed people, they already know they have no reason to come to you. They've already seen what's in there. They've already seen what suggestions. They've seen the people that are brought in for author talks. They've already seen it. And now this has become a place that's not for them, right? So we can't wait for these things to happen. And according to these numbers, the change in the US is happening. So it's already happened, actually. We're late. We've missed it. So when talking about the need for diversity and inclusivity in library collections, many of us, particularly those who work in children's services, know Dr. Eugene Sims Bishop's concept of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. It paints an amazing picture about why it's important for all children to have access to books that feature a diverse cast of main characters. So we know that the mirrors allow people to see themselves represented in stories. The windows allow people to view the lived experiences of others, and the sliding glass doors allow people to cross into new worlds and learn to empathize with others. So it's an amazing way to summarize the importance of diverse collections with 3 words. It's really great. 4 words. What we as librarians need to do is make sure that the diverse books we're adding to our collection portray a variety of inclusive experiences. We want to see people with disabilities performing on stage. We want to see Black people who grew up in suburban and rural settings. We want to see members of the Indigenous community living life today in 2023. That's the goal. So when we don't do that, right, when that is not how our collection presents, we aren't showing the full scope of the human experience for marginalized people. The books that we do and don't have on our shelves are speaking for us, right? They're doing the talking, kind of regardless of what we ourselves are saying, because as we all know, actions speak louder than words. So if most of our books about Indigenous peoples are historical, that's saying something to the people who are looking at your shelves, and it's saying something to everyone from a marginalized background. It's not just something that may stand out to members of our Indigenous communities. It's going to stand out to people who are really looking for a variety of experiences and stories in your collection. So if we know that there are more children under the age of 15 that identify as people of color, we can expect that those children and teens are going to have a variety of lived experiences and are going to need to find themselves represented, right? So according to the CDC, 1 in 4 adults live with a disability, and they may exist at a variety of intersections. So an inclusive collection allows people not only of different racial, ethnic, and other marginalized backgrounds to find books, but people of different lived experiences within those marginalized backgrounds to find books with a similar lived experience, right? And books that are just plain fun, right? We don't always need to read our story, because I don't need to read a book about a Black librarian going about her day. I'm doing that right now. But sometimes you wanna read about adventure, someone getting lost on an island and building a ramp to get off, right? Sometimes you just want things that are entertaining. So what type of ordering changes do we need to make? When ordering books for your library collection. Typically we find some traditional review journals, and they are an absolutely amazing asset. To anyone who doesn't know, I also highly suggest within those review journals, not just the pages with the reviews, but those pages that like highlight certain topics like hot historical fiction, right? Like those are great. Like there's bread and butter in those resources, a ton. Something also to do is to take a look at who's in your community, what's happening in your community now, and what can you sense, or what looks like it might be coming down the pipeline, coming down the road, right? Is your community discussing or involved in social justice conversations? Do we see those percolating up, maybe in school systems, at board meetings, at finance meetings? What's going on? Does your community have a large immigrant or a new American population? In Connecticut, there was a large group of Afghan refugees, and a whole statewide committee that was formed to help address the needs of this new group of folks that were coming into our state and to our communities. Right, that matters, right? Does your community have an active LGBTQIA plus community and run events, right? Like, is there a massive pride event that happens in your town where people from all over the state or all over the county come to? Identifying who's in your community and what's happening in your community, and sometimes your state, right? If whole statewide committees are being formed, we might need to pay attention whether we think this affects our community or not. Take that information, and then in addition to these traditional review journals, I think it's beneficial to identify 3 to 4 non-traditional resources to check regularly, and consider when ordering for your community and keeping in mind the changing needs of your community. So, and because every community's makeup is different, these non-traditional resources are going to be different, right? Like, there are certain, everyone in the world that I know uses School Library Journal, who's a youth services consultant or a youth services librarian, and everyone uses Library Journal. But if in your community you see that there is a large Indigenous population, in addition to those traditional review journals that you use, maybe take a peek at somewhere like Heart Drum Publishing, right? And sort of look at some of the books that they're coming out with, look at some of the books that they are suggesting, look at the book awards that feature books written by Indigenous people. If you are one of those communities that has like a huge pride parade that people come from all over the state to attend, maybe take a look at the Rainbow Roundtable, and maybe take a look at some of the books that are suggested there. Read some of the best practices there about things like stickering and labeling LGBTQIA plus books. If you are in a town, in a state that has a large immigrant population or new American population, take a look at something like I'm Your Neighbor books, for example, because that's what they specialize in. So we can't read all things all the time. We can't hold all of the information in the world in our brains, or flip through all of the magazines or websites as we're doing our ordering. But 2 to 4, I would hope that we would want to prioritize and make space for, if our ultimate goal is to build an inclusive collection, and if our ultimate goal is to welcome new community members and make community members feel welcome through what's available in our collection. So this is just a list of some of the resources that I have used at one point or another. I've updated it a little bit. Like Reading Glasses is a podcast, something new to me. I had never listed it, but I use NetGalley all the time. And I have like a running list of books that are coming out that I know I want to order for my collection, or things that I'm kind of pre-reading to decide what to order for my collection. Edelweiss has publisher catalogs, so you can go through all of those and see what's coming up in the next reading season. So this is just sort of a list of titles that, or of resources that I have used across my time working in public libraries. And I've worked in everything from an urban community categorized as a distressed municipality, an affluent yet also rural community, a bookmobile that traveled around a city where more than 20 different languages were spoken, and now for the entire state of Connecticut, which is harder than all of that, all the other stuff put together, quite frankly. So then maintenance, right? How do we maintain these collections once we have built them, or what do we do to our collection as we are working to build up these inclusive library collections? And boring though it may sound, the first thing that we really need to do is weed. We have to weed our collection. Part of maintaining an inclusive collection is having a browsable collection, having a collection where people can find what it is that they're looking for. And as hard as it may be for some of us, libraries are not Amazon. We do not need to have 4 copies of Bark George, maybe. Maybe we don't need 4. Maybe we don't need 4 copies of every Percy Jackson book. Maybe we don't. Maybe we do, but maybe we don't. It's too often that collections that look like the image under Not This, where things are kind of forced in and stacked on top of each other and disheveled. A lot of these books that we think people don't want, they're just not discoverable. It's not that nobody wants them, it's that nobody can find them. And just as often as we know that there are people that come into the library that, ask for something similar to Janet Ivanovich and Sophie Kinsella, there are people who are going to come in and they don't want to make eye contact with us. They don't want to they don't want to talk to us. They want to go in, find a book, check it out, and get out, right? So we need to set them up for success when we're dealing with what our shelves look like, when we're managing our collection. What can happen during the management and weeding of the collection is that people will realize that a lot of the books who are on their weeding list, we suggest and use the crew method, realize that a lot of the books feature marginalized titles. So what do? Nobody's taking the books. I'm trying to build this inclusive collection according to the weeding method. I should delete all these. What now, right? So what now? One of the things that I like to do, sometimes maybe those books need to go, especially if they're older, or if they have older covers, right? Like I know they've redone the cover for like Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry 97 times. Sometimes the problem is that it's an old title and we need to modernize, or it's an old cover image and we need to modernize. But there are ways to deal with that, right? There are ways to kind of double check and see, like, is it really that no one wants these books, or is it that my shelves were packed and kind of disheveled and no one could find them? So it doesn't have to be this youth services looking, but one of the things that we used to do was some version of the Island of Misfit Books, right? Obviously modeled after the Island of Misfit Toys. And it would be a book cart or a table, something like that, where we would put the books up that were up for deselection. And we might put a sign up that explained why these particular books were here, and sort of offer them up in an easily discoverable way. And at the end of a set amount of time, maybe 3 weeks, maybe a month, something like that, whatever was left on that table or on that cart we had done our best and it was time for it to go. Anything that was checked out would be checked out and returned, and just through normal circulation process would be reshelved. And it was kind of a last ditch effort to see um, if it really was that these particular books weren't wanted, or if they couldn't be found. And that's just an option. There are other versions of this that folks can kind of do and run with as they see fit. But there are options when that happens. There are also, with regards to maintaining an inclusive collection, audits, lots of audits. Auditing your collection, which we have a video of, that's hyperlinked there, which is a long process. So one of the things that we suggest when talking about audit collections is, if you want something that you can do today, something right now that you can walk away with, auditing a cart. When we go into Baker and Taylor, or when we go into Follett, or when we are sitting down with some other book distributor to place an order, we are making selections. We're making selections for every member of our community. Why are we making the selections that we're making? Why are we choosing the books that we're choosing and not something else? Really sitting with that and using something like an audit sheet can really sort of help that process. So, and that's also something that can happen like today, right now, when you log into Baker and Taylor and work on a cart that you are planning to order, as well as auditing displays. We don't need to wait until Women's History Month to put out books about women historians, history people. We don't need to wait until Black History Month to put out those books on Malcolm and Martin. We don't, and it doesn't even have to be them, right? Like Madam C.J. Walker, Bessie Coleman, like there are other people. Really go through and look at whose faces, stories, experiences, and voices are represented in your face outs and in your book displays. And again, if we're really serious about prioritizing the creation and maintenance of these inclusive collections, I would really suggest, to the best of our ability, building time to do this into our schedule, even if it's just 1 hour a week. Like, even if you know that Friday mornings are relatively slower than other mornings, even if it's just something small and simple like that, I really, really suggest building that into your calendar or whatever it may be. And again, kind of like how I mentioned before, when selecting items, really sitting with yourself and your decisions and identifying where those decisions are coming from. Why am I choosing this book? How does this book compare to other books on my shelves? What is the possible harm done versus the possible knowledge gained from this book? And can the intended lesson be taught another way? And is there another book that can do this, explain this, show this better in a less harmful manner? Tough conversations. Woo. So one of the things that we need to ask ourselves is, how comfortable are we having blunt and honest conversations about things like sexual orientation, race, and systemic inequity, neurodivergence, and things that come up with other marginalized and invisible groups of people? So there are ways in which we can prepare ourselves for these difficult conversations, things like professional development courses. And my personal and sometimes controversial opinion is that I do not believe that someone can do authentic equity work between the hours of 9 to 5, or whatever your workday hours are. I really believe that knowledge needs to be gained in some way, shape, or form beyond the time that you're getting paid to be doing it. That being said, we don't want to discourage folks by requiring quote unquote extra work, right? So the way that I try to go about explaining this is that this might require being more intentional about books that you're reading if you're a reader. If you are a reader of nonfiction, maybe pick up a book that you wouldn't normally pick up about someone of a different background or about a time period that you know nothing about. If you are a podcast listener in the car on the way to work, this might require expanding your podcasts. If you listen to a lot of pop culture podcasts, by all means, go forth and pop culture away, but maybe throw into the mix something that can educate you on your drive to work about marginalized and oppressed peoples. If you are a documentary watcher, do the same with that. Whatever you take in and absorb outside of the office, maybe include one thing that you wouldn't normally pick up, reach for, or turn on, right? And learn that way, right? Get additional learning that way. We also have to prepare ourselves for the fact that some people, when they approach us to talk about books, they're approaching the conversation with minds made up. They are made up. You can't tell them anything. They are essentially bad faith actors when they walk up to start to have a conversation. And the more information that we have at the ready, the better off we're going to be. And that's why I say, do what you can, like reading a different book, listening to a different podcast, watching a different documentary, whatever it is, so that we have the information ready when we are having some of these conversations that some folks think are uncomfortable, because some of these conversations are not uncomfortable to me, but they might be uncomfortable to somebody else. So the more information that we have at the ready, the more prepared we are to have a conversation, the better off we're going to be. Because it seems that some folks, that's the hard part, right? Is having the conversation. And I think what we're doing when we have that information and when we're ready to talk clearly about that information, what we're doing is we're putting the science back in library science. So I think libraries and librarians are really, really good at talking about mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. When faced with book challenges, we are really good at talking about how important it is that marginalized people are able to see their lived experiences in books and that they're able to see themselves as the hero. And I think we're also really good at talking about how important it is that all of us are able to read about the lived experiences of others to help us sympathize and empathize with community members. Sometimes we need to do more than that, and sometimes we need to essentially put the science back in library science and include facts with our thoughts and feelings. So last year in 2022, there was a high school in Missouri that removed Dear Martin from a school reading assignment and replaced it with To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, To Kill a Mockingbird, as we all know, is held up as like one of the best books of all time. I'm not sure you can make it through a single calendar year without To Kill a Mockingbird showing up somewhere, somehow, some way. And I don't exactly know what conversations took place at the meetings that may have happened at that high school. But when I read the article and I realized that they were replacing Dear Martin with To Kill a Mockingbird, something jumped out at me. And To Kill a Mockingbird, right? It's a book that takes place during, I think it was the Great Depression. I wrote that down. I hope I'm right. Where there's a Black man falsely accused of assaulting a white woman. And some of the themes of the book were like good and evil, racial prejudice, courage and bravery, justice versus the law, knowledge and education, a lack of trust in institutions, and a loss of innocence. I think would sum up really well what the themes of that book are. So then I read Dear Martin because I don't always. It took me a while to read it. because of just the subject matter of the book. So it took me a while to read it, but I'm really glad I did. And what I know about Dear Martin is that it's a book that takes place in the 2010s, and a Black teen is falsely accused of what feels like everything. It feels like anything that they can accuse this kid of, they accuse him of. But some of the themes of that book are good versus evil, racial prejudice, courage and bravery, justice versus the law, knowledge and education, a lack of trust in institutions, and a loss of innocence. I kid you not. If you haven't read the book, I promise you, those are some of the themes in the book. And because I didn't want this slide to just have two books on it, I had another one. Internment, a book that takes place in the near future, where Muslim American people are sent to internment camps. And some themes of that book: good versus evil, racial prejudice, courage and bravery, justice versus the law, knowledge and education, a lack of trust in institutions, and the loss of innocence. Fascinating. So the themes here on the surface are all the same. And we can go ahead and focus on To Kill a Mockingbird and Dear Martin for the sake of the, ultimately this conversation that we were having. So, oops. Okay. Um, these are To Kill a Mockingbird and Dear Martin are two different books written by two different people with two different storylines. They're not the same storyline. But if we remember, this is for a high school, this is for a school assignment. One of the main differences with this book with regards to the theme of the book, in theory, what someone could take away from this book is the perspective with which they were written. To Kill a Mockingbird was written from a white perspective. And that is the story that we are getting. You're getting the story and the perspective of the story from white people. And Dear Martin is written from a Black perspective, and we are getting the story with the same themes from the perspective, from the mind, and from the lived experience of a Black person. So, like I said, not being in that community and not knowing if these were good faith or bad faith conversations, I don't know if bringing these connections up would have helped the conversation in any way, um, or would have, I don't want to say moved the conversation in a different direction. And I don't want to necessarily say that it would have had a different outcome, but that's the type of thing that I would have brought to a conversation with regards to um, working within your library structure with regards to challenges and things like that. That's where I would have taken the conversation instead of the mirrors, windows, and sliding. Well, I don't want to say instead of, in addition to the mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors concept, which is so important, right? Growing up in the 90s and not being able to find books with my lived experience, I'm a walking, talking adult walking, talking adult example of what that can do to a reader or a child and how that can make them feel. And the answer is really bad. But depending on the structure, like depending on the space in which you are having this conversation, I think depends on the type of information that you should come with. And like I said, we need to sometimes add something to the mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors conversation that we're having. And we need to essentially put the science back in library science, which means we have to know these books. To the best of our ability, we have to really understand what it is that we're talking about when we're having these conversations. Talk about the themes, right? And put together information like this to do what you as a librarian know is the right thing to do. And I touched on this before, but challenge forms and collection management policies are just like the bread and butter, the backbone of the book challenge process. If our policies are not updated and are not well put together, we are doomed. We do not have a leg to stand on. Especially because these policies are typically signed off on by our library director and by our library boards. We need this, what might seem like a boring piece of paper or a not important process, to be as up to date as possible. And recently, my job has completely redone our collection management policy, and we made sure to include acquisitions and weeding and deselection in there. But we also updated our challenge form using a model that we got, I think it was from Book Riot, that sort of removes the ability for the copy and paste model that we've seen some groups have when they decide to go after a singular title in multiple locations. Having a challenge form that eliminates the ability for folks to be able to do that can be really, really helpful for us in the long run. So again, it's kind of moving away from reactionary into actionary. I can't remember the word. And finally, in conclusion, I think something to think about as we're going through this process is that there is no checklist. There is no one size fits all. I'm so sorry. There is no done. Like, this is never something that's completed. And I think it's really important for us to remember that DEI, SJDEIA, whatever it is you call it, is not a literary unit or theme. It is not a unit in a class. It is not a theme for a story time or for a week. It's just not. And by doing the work, you are doing the work. Thank you very much.